Hey folks, I'm Emily. I'm the founder and editor of theclosetfeminist.ca. It's now June, so we are halfway through the magazine publishing calendar. I thought it might be interesting to examine some magazines and take a look at the diversity, or rather lack thereof, of some of the issues that have been published so far. What I'm going to be looking at is the major editorial of each issue of Lucky magazine published so far this year. I'm using Lucky in particular for two reasons. The first is that I wanted to use a magazine that would be familiar to the closet feminists reading audience, which, from what I can tell, are folks from Canada and the States, and Lucky is widely available in both of these countries in case you wanted to follow up on this project yourself. The second reason I chose Lucky is that I really love Lucky magazine. I've been a subscriber for years, and so I haven't missed an issue in quite a while. Let's get started. Lucky got off to a really positive start. Their first issue of 2013 featured Jennifer Hudson, a woman of color, on the cover, which is fantastic. And the editorial? Well, things get even better because they feature a model of color in the editorial. It's a great way to start the year and seems to show Lucky's commitment to diversity. The February issue was interesting to say the least. Catherine Fee was on the cover, and the editorial, well, to me, this editorial has its ups and downs. They hired 3 models for this shoot, and only one of them, the woman in the middle, who is Kenza Ferrati, is a woman of color having an Arab background. This is great, but I'd also like to take this opportunity to point out a common trend I see in fashion editorials that have more than one model. I have observed that, as a general trend, magazines hardly ever feature an editorial wherein an ensemble of models is composed entirely of models who represent minorities. There seems to be this need to have at least one white model no matter what. I find this somewhat ironic, as it would seem that editors seek to somehow balance out the token minority they hire. This being said, I'd also like to point out that of these 3 models, none of them appear to be plus size, which is another great opportunity for diversity which Lucky missed. Moving along, let's take a look at the March issue. It starred Lauren Conrad on the cover, and keeping up with the status quo, featured just one model who is thin and white. In April of Lucky, we saw Julie Bowen on the cover, which is actually kind of cool because she's in her 40s and magazine covers tend to feature younger women as an unwritten rule. Ironically, Bowen is the oldest cover star that Lucky has had so far this year, being older than the cover star of his so-called beauty issue, which we see coming up next in April, which of course focused a lot on anti-aging products and advice. If the April editorial seems reminiscent of the February shoot, it's because it's almost exactly the same thing. Kenza Ferrati is once again the only model of color out of 3 models, and once again the other 2 models are thin and white. It is dually bizarre because the other 2 models, the blonde and the brunette on the left, are not the same as the February shoot, which you might assume at first glance since the editorials are so incredibly similar. In other words, Lucky went out of their way to hire an ensemble of models that they basically already used once this year. And just like the February editorial, none of them are plus size. The fact that Lucky has done this twice so far in 2013, casting 2 very similar ensembles of models, and we're only at April, speaks volumes about the determination of this magazine to support the status quo. They had another opportunity to be especially diverse, given that they once again hired 3 models, yet they chose ultimately not to take it. Moving on to the May issue, we see Drew Barrymore on the cover. As previously mentioned, this issue is considered the beauty issue. You can't really see, but that's what it says right here in the top corner. Apparently, what Lucky considers beautiful is once again thin and white, since that's the sort of model they chose for their May editorial. So now we're up to speed with the June/July issue of Lucky, which is currently available on newsstands. And oh boy, what an interesting issue it is. It actually seems really positive at first. It features Christina Hendricks on the cover. Hendricks is not only very well known for her incredible acting skills like we see in Mad Men, but she is also a role model for full-figure or plus-size Hollywood icons, which as we know are relatively rare. It's also nice to see Hendricks on the cover because, like Julie Bowen, who we talked about for the April issue, Hendricks is relatively older than other cover stars, being in her late 30s. After this, things get a little weird. For only the second time this year, Lucky hired a model of color to be the solo star of the major fashion spread. Remember, the last time they cast a model of color alone for a major editorial was in January. Hiring a model of color in itself, of course, isn't weird. At first glance, it's actually a really positive step forward. So what is the problem then? I say this issue is kind of weird because it's kind of like Lucky really wants you to know that they actually hired a model of color, like it's some sort of groundbreaking thing that they deserve a gold star for. I say this because they mention the model's name, Wang Xiao, 3 times throughout the issue. The first is in the letter from the editor, right here, and then twice in the editorial itself. This is actually very unusual for a fashion magazine. Magazines almost never give the names of the models that they use, unless the model is also on the cover of the magazine, like we saw with the March 2013 issue of Flair, which featured Charlotte Free. In a way, mentioning Wang Xiao's name 3 times seems like they're overcompensating for all these months that they weren't using any models of color. It is also interesting to note that they didn't name the other model of color, the one from the January issue, once. This is especially concerning because it would seem that naming a model representing one minority in the fashion world is more important than naming another, potentially creating a very disturbing hierarchy. This leads me to feel that overall, this particular issue of Lucky smacks heavily of tokenism. The anxious and repetitive naming of Wang Xiao, drawing attention to their attempt to diversify their publication, could have been avoided entirely, of course, if they had just hired more models of color or plus-size models in the first place. Wrapping up this conversation, I just wanted to say again, I do love Lucky magazine. I read it for a really long time, and even though it's glaringly obvious they have serious issues with diversity, I'll probably still keep subscribing to it. I'm inspired by Anita Sarkeesian, the founder of pop culture blog Feminist Frequency, who reminds us in her videos that, quote, "It is both possible and even necessary to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects," end quote. There is definitely hope, though. Very recently, on June 18th, news broke that Eva Chen will be replacing Brandon Hawley as the editor-in-chief of Lucky. Chen is the first Asian American editor-in-chief out of all of Condé Nast's publications, so yay for women of color in the media, and also here's hoping that Chen will bring some much-needed diversity to the pages of this particular magazine.